Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Bocamazzo. I'm the publisher at Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this morning's Diversity and Inclusion program. Today, we're going to have two panel presentations that will discuss concrete steps towards inclusion and provide an overview of diversity and inclusion in the legal profession. To start, I'd like to thank this morning's sponsors, Nelson Mullins and Beryl. Both presentations this morning are being recorded, and you'll all receive a copy of that recording by email in the next day or two. Our panelists are all looking forward to taking questions from the audience at the end of each presentation. To ask a question, you should look for the Q&A bubble in the Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen, and you could enter a question through that window at any time. This is the third year that Lawyers Weekly has put on this program, and each time we have partnered with Color on this event. Color is a sister company of Lawyers Weekly, and we're also lucky enough to share office space here in Boston. I'd now like to introduce Camilla Avant, the Director of Diversity Programs at Color, to say a few words.
Hello, and thank you, Susan. For those not familiar with Color, we are a diversity inclusion event-based and online publication that focuses on creating informative content and thought leadership addressing D&I issues. In addition, we highlight the achievements of professionals of color. I would like to give a special thanks to our sister publication, Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly, for partnering again on this event now in its third year. And I welcome Susan back for some introductions.
Thank you, Camilla. It's nice to see you. I can't wait till I can see you in person in the office. I am now pleased to introduce the moderators of our first panel, which will look at concrete steps that firms, legal departments, and businesses need to be taking towards inclusion. Christine Kingston of Nelson Mullins practices in state and federal trial and appellate courts, focusing on complex business litigation, commercial disputes, and consumer financial services litigation. Melanie Todman of Nelson Mullins focuses her practice primarily on complex civil litigation, internal governmental investigations, and advising and representing state government entities. Christine and Melanie, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan and Camilla. Melanie and I are thrilled to be here and co-moderating this panel. We have a really exciting discussion planned for you today. I wanted to introduce our panelists first. We have Shanika L. Davis. She's Associate General Counsel at UMass Memorial Healthcare, Inc. Good morning, Shanika, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
We also have Sharina Wright, who is Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Suffolk University Law School. And thank you so much, Sharina, for being here, and we're thrilled to have you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So before we dive in, I wanted to mention we are reserving 15 minutes at the end of our discussion for a question and answer session. We really want to hear from you, so please submit your questions at any time during the panel using the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen. If you don't feel comfortable submitting your questions that way, feel free to email me directly at christine.kingston@nelsonmullins.com. I'll be monitoring that email throughout the panel. So let's get started. We're going to be talking a lot today about concrete actions, what we are doing, what we're not doing, what we should be doing to create and maintain diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in our legal community and our greater communities. But I think it makes sense to start with those words and what they mean, and to figure out what exactly are we working towards and what are we fighting for. So Shanika, I wanted to start with you. Why are we using, or why should we be using those four words in particular, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, besides, for example, diversity and inclusion? And what do those words mean to you?
So I think diversity, equity, belonging, and inclusion are important words to start with. So when I think diversity, I think maybe the numbers. When I think equity, I think equal opportunity as far as promotion, as far as policies that treat everyone in a way that provides them with upward mobility. Belonging is something extremely important. It's a sense of community. So when I go to work, do I feel like I belong in the space? Do I have a community that supports me and my whole person? And inclusion is to me is being the voice at the table. Do you have a culture in your business or organization that allows for people to speak up and state their opinions on things, particularly around sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion? So that's what those words mean to me. And I think if we are really going to shift cultures, we need to attack and create solutions and initiatives for each piece of that.
And Serena, I'm interested to hear your perspective as someone who's training the next generation of lawyers. What do those words mean to the law students that you work with?
In the legal profession, we start in law school, right? And so for me, it's about the pipeline to getting the next generation of lawyers prepared for what that looks like now while they're students, but also what it will look like when they become attorneys. And so like Shanika said, diversity for me is about representation. Is there representation in law schools? Are we talking, if we're talking racial diversity, which is, what's in popular demand right now is diversity, equity, and inclusion based on race, is there racial diversity in law schools? And then is there going to be racial diversity in the firms, in the public sector, in the corporations that the law students are then going to go to? Equity, like Shanika's mentioned, is about equitable and just processes and procedures. Is the policies fair? At the law school level, is our grading fair? Are people feeling like things are fair in the classroom? And so on and so forth. Are there equitable measures being made during the internship and externship process for students? And then inclusion. Are people feeling included? Are people feeling a part of the discussion? And then to belong is to really be able to not just be included in the discussion, but feel like you belong there enough to speak up and to say something, and to really feel like what you're saying matters and it's valued. And I think that's so important, the culture, so that people feel like when they're saying things, it's not just being said to be said, but that someone actually values what you're saying just as much as the dominant group, whatever that looks like, whether it's your white counterparts, LGBTQ people may feel left out in some ways and others. And so for me, those are what those words mean, not just in my work, but beyond that, in my day-to-day, that's what I think of when I think of those 4 words. And like Shanika, I do think that they're very different. And so I'm excited to talk about the things we're going to talk about today to figure out how people can move forward and thinking about all of them and not just one or another.
I'm curious to know, we're going to be talking about things that we should be doing and can be doing, but just from broadly speaking, where do you think we're failing most? And conversely, where do you think we've made the most strides? And just focusing right now on our legal community here in Boston. And Shanika, I'll start with you.
Failing the most, I think it depends. I think a lot of places have started to move the ball forward and actually care about the issues. I think other institutions are just for the numbers, and they might have a statement that says that they value diversity, but if you look at who makes up the leadership, there's very minimal diversity. If you look at who they hire, there's very minimal diversity. And so I think where we fail the most, or is putting our words into action, and really truly understanding the importance of it. Why is it important to have a diverse bar? Why is it important to have a diverse team of leadership?
You made an interesting point that it's not just enough to hire diverse attorneys, but we have to put them in places of leadership and power, right? And that might be the intersection of diversity and inclusion, that, okay, once you get your foot in the door, we still have to do things to advance, because it's not enough to have diversity in your company, period. You have to have it in the senior levels of management. Would you agree with that?
I agree. And I think also the idea of tokenism, right? So some places may hire people so they could say they have this person of color. But that person may not have power, one, but also a feeling of belonging. They might feel like they are just there to be a part of, to check something off, essentially. So I think that's important. And if you have more diverse leadership, you have more diverse thought. And so when things aren't correct, someone can speak up because everyone in the room is not thinking the same.
Right, and I think it makes sense to, we can move to our second topic now, which is about sponsorship and mentorship and advancement. So, you know, once we can talk about pipeline as well, but once we have a pipeline and we're committed to hiring diverse attorneys, what are we doing to advance them and to support them?
Right. So I actually think this is a really nice segue into sponsorship and mentorship and how that can be used to advance our diversity and inclusion goals. You know, one of the things that I've heard a lot of in the law firm context is that there aren't enough candidates from underrepresented groups to ensure a diverse workforce. You know, setting aside whether or not that's true, you know, I know that corporations and institutions like Suffolk are investing in pipeline programming where they're approaching, mentoring, sponsoring folks at a very young age, like in high school, to create a pipeline. So I have a couple of questions related to that. You know, Sharice, I would love to hear more about what you and Suffolk are doing in this regard and the thinking behind that programming. And then for both of you, you know, what can law firms, legal departments, and other legal institutions do, including potentially early interventions, to create their own pipeline so there are enough candidates?
Melanie, I think that you hit it right on the head at the end, intervention. You know, there's so much to be said about the pipeline and the fact that the pipeline to the legal profession, there's achievement gap issues, right? We could go on and on. I could go on and on about how challenging it is even for BIPOC students to even get to the door of law school, right? And so law schools across the nation, including Suffolk, are starting to look at what more can be done. How do we intervene earlier? How do we educate college students, high school students about what the LSAT is, what GPA you need, what does a personal statement look like, right? These are barriers to entry. If you come from an impoverished part of the country and you're a first generation college student, you have nothing to look at to know what to do to even get yourself in the door, right? And so it's so important that we educate and earlier. And so that's part of what we do at Suffolk, right? We go on, when we're recruiting for law students, we go and we travel and we do law school 101s and really just help college students understand what it takes to get into law school and not in their senior year, right? If you're a freshman or sophomore and you're interested in going to law school, I want to talk to you. I want to know what you're doing in terms of making sure your GPA is as high as possible, right? I want to talk to you about what the LSAT is and what LSAT prep looks like, right? And then when you get to your junior and senior year, I want to talk to you again. I want to help you with your application. And so that's a part of pipelining as well. That's that mentorship piece from before they even get to my admissions office. And then when they get to the admissions office and they're admitted, there's programming. At Suffolk, we have a peer diversity, peer mentorship program, an academic achievement program, Progress to Success. And it's about pairing our 1Ls with upper class students, not just attorneys, but people that look like them that are already doing it in the building, right? And workshops, helping them network with attorneys like yourselves so that they can really understand and appreciate that someone looks like them, someone may come from the same background as them, and they did it. So you can do it, right? It's about that community piece. Community is a big piece of the pipeline and making sure people feel like they're supported, they have mentorship, they have sponsorship. And so we try to start that at Suffolk from day one for all of our students, right? It's so important that people feel supported and like they belong from the beginning, because it's life-changing to the trajectory of their success.
Shanika, I don't know if you have any thoughts on.
Yeah, I do. I think I second everything Sharina said. I will also add, after they graduate, right, it's important to give students of diverse every student, but particularly I think about like first generational law students who might not fit into the culture, as some people would say at different firms, right? They're new lawyers, they don't really know the process, but they're really bright and they've done well in school. Because I've seen law graduates who have done well in school, who are extremely bright and still have difficulty finding a job because maybe they have an accent, or maybe they can't afford the right clothes, or whatever it may be. And so like really giving people an opportunity, even if they are different from what your organization's norm is or your law firm's norm is. I'm very lucky to work for an organization that truly values having our employees look like the communities we serve. And we serve a very diverse group of patients. And I remember when I initially went to the interview, I wasn't the only diverse lawyer in the room, you know, and that was something that I took note of. Okay, so I'm not the only diverse lawyer in the room. Also, my organization, we have diversity teams, diversity groups to meet amongst all stakeholders, and we meet. We also have a chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer who is in senior leadership. And not only do we have that position, but we provide them with employees, because I think a lot of diversity and inclusion offices don't necessarily have enough employees to fulfill their goal. And also search firms. So if law firms or companies are feeling like they don't have enough diverse candidates, there are search firms out there that specialize in finding diverse talent. And as far as the pipeline, contributing funds so that lawyers can attend leadership groups. I know the partnership, for example, is one that's well known. Are you going to invest in your attorney so they can become the next partner, or become the next general counsel?
Yeah, I think that point about, you know, being a candidate and walking to a room and seeing other people like you, and seeing other people like you in leadership positions is really well taken. I know, definitely for me as well. And kind of piggybacking off of that, you know, once you get to your law firm or your legal department, what does sponsorship and mentorship look like when you're trying to build a diverse workforce? What are, you know, 2 or 3 specific actions that you seem to be particularly effective for retaining people?
I'd say one thing that I immediately think of is sponsorship doesn't have to mean the person looks like you, whether that's gender or your racial diversity. And I think it's important for organizations to remember that. And are you going into the office of your diverse new hires and saying, hey, I want to sponsor you? Hey, I want to mentor you. Hey, what are your career goals, right? Sometimes it's not defining it as mentorship or sponsorship. Sometimes that will happen organically by you just being a teacher to this younger attorney. The other thing I will say is I think that sponsorship and mentorship could happen earlier, especially for your diverse attorneys that you're potentially looking to hire. Are you going into the law schools and networking with them? You know, we often encourage law students to go out and seek the affinity bar associations, the Boston Bar Association, the MBA, and so on and so forth. And so are you mixing and mingling with people that maybe you wouldn't typically, people that don't look like you, that don't come from the same background with you? One, that helps you with recruiting, right? But two, it helps you build and foster relationships with up and coming attorneys in a way that you otherwise wouldn't once they're already in the door. And so to that inclusion and belonging piece, you're ready to sponsor them. You're ready to be that type of ally to them because you've built that relationship and that rapport even 6 months prior to them coming in to the door. So sponsorship and mentorship can look in many different ways. And I think that is one thing that I don't know people at the top do as much as we always tell law students to do, but are we going back and doing the same with them? I think that's an important piece to mentorship and sponsorship.
And Sharina, I think you made a really good point about sponsorship, which I think, some people say, well, what does that actually mean? And you made a point that sometimes it's as simple as just reaching out and checking on someone and saying, do you have enough work? How is work going? How are you doing? And, we've already seen studies about the pandemic and about how, diverse attorneys who might already be feeling a little bit isolated and like they don't belong, the pandemic can worsen that because we're working from home, we're not in contact enough. And Shanika, I'll start with you. Have you seen that shift during the pandemic? And what are things we can do to bring these people back in, make them feel like they belong, which is, as you mentioned before, critically important?
I think the pandemic has made a lot of people from all backgrounds feel like they don't belong, right? From the technology, like having to get used to like Zoom and videos, and having to think creatively about how to, where you in the past might do lunches or something like that. We're not doing that at the moment. So how do you make a virtual Zoom that's engaging to all of your employees, both from diverse backgrounds and not? I think also just staying in touch. So there's nothing like a phone call to check in. I think also as far as the students are concerned, just to piggyback a little bit what Sharina said earlier, the affinity student organizations are still active. And they want to learn how to succeed in the field of law. And so actively engaging them. As an employer, making sure that you're aware of all the holidays and celebrating that and getting input from your employees. How can we continue to have a sense of belonging in this current landscape? And not only getting the input, but putting some of the ideas to action.
Sharina, have you seen it? Sorry, Melanie.
I think that's such an important point is actually talking to your employees. I think that folks will be surprised by how many ideas people have and how many thoughts people have about how to create diversity and inclusion. And so, you should use that resource. Absolutely.
And Sharina, have you seen impacts on your law students because of the pandemic? And are you seeing some more isolation, particularly with your diverse law students?
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic is tough. And I would like to say in 2020, there's been multiple pandemics, right? And so for diverse law students in particular, it's not just COVID, it's all the police brutality and what's going on politically and what that means in the classroom, even in a virtual classroom and outside of the classroom. And so absolutely, I think that this has been a tough year for many. And law students are not exempt. I do think that we have done our best to do those check-ins. Our Dean of Students office is fabulous and working with the affinity organizations and others to really make sure we're calling and checking in on our students and not just, calling when it's related to academics, but also saying, hey, how are you? And we've done that this semester as well as last semester to really make sure that students know that they have support and they have resources. We've created emergency funds and things of that nature to also help students financially, because this has been something that has impacted many, not just health-wise, but financially, right? And so while we may not be able to make all of our students whole, we definitely have have looked to see what resources we can provide to support them, especially those who had to work, right? A lot of our diverse students come in and have to work part-time jobs. And so can we find work for you? Can we fill the gap that way? Or if not, can we do some other type of support? So I think that there's many supports we've had to help students with, but we've been ready and able, and I'm fortunate for that, to be able to provide mental, physical, and financial support to our students when they need it.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear, we're seeing reports, particularly that women are affected during the pandemic and juggling work and childcare responsibilities, and it's disproportionately affecting women and women of color. What can employers do to support? We don't want to lose this talent. Certainly that hurts employers. What can employers do and what should employers do to address this?
I think offering childcare services for those employees that need to go into the office, flexible scheduling. So a lot of schools are remote now too, and so employees are having to teach, make sure their children are, keeping on top of their studies while working. So having flexible schedules, encouraging people to step up if they can support another employee that is having difficulty, whether it's more hours or just a sense of support. And I think flexible schedule is really key, and childcare if the individuals have to go into the office.
As someone with a little one, I would say, beyond what Shanika is discussing, which childcare is fabulous, and I understand not every organization can provide additional childcare support, but even just respecting boundaries. So many of us are working more than our typical, if you're in corporate America or in the nonprofit sector, your regular 40 hours, right? And I'm sure in firms you're working more than your traditional billable hours. And so what are we doing to recognize and respect boundaries a little bit more when the burnout is so much more real than it was a year ago this time? And so even just saying, hey, I know that colleague, I know that employee has little ones at home. I'm not going to email them something that I know they will reply to because it's dinner time. Just that type of appreciation and consideration is another part of inclusion and belonging, right? Is making sure people feel appreciated and respected enough to respect boundaries during this challenging time in the world.
Yeah, and to echo what Sharina said, I think also creating a culture where it's okay for employees to step up and say, I'm not available at 6 o'clock because that's dinner time.
It's interesting. I just thought of, sometimes judges impose unrealistic expectations on attorneys too. And so, I don't know if we have any judges on the program today, but sometimes with 3-day deadlines, hearings that are unexpectedly scheduled, and that can be really difficult. So it just seems like this is something that we should all be thinking about, from all the way up from judges to everyone in the legal profession, our employers, our lawyers, and our law students. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about getting buy-in from leadership. And we know now there's so many studies that tell us that if you have a more diverse workforce, it's going to make you more productive and more profitable, particularly if you have more diversity in your senior levels of management. I don't think it's up for really dispute at this point, but yet we still seem to have trouble convincing our leaders to really invest time and money into these efforts. And so I want to talk about a couple of concrete areas where we know for a fact that it's going to affect your bottom line. And I want to start with reputation. And Sharina, I'm thinking of you because you have a good perspective on this. Without naming names, if a company or a law firm has a really poor track record around diversity and inclusion, is this something, and I'm guessing the answer is yes, but is this something that law students and law schools are aware of? And is this affecting their decisions about where to even apply and where to work?
Yes, reputation is a big thing, right? Just as important as it is for the law schools, it's important for the firms. So absolutely, when students are hearing things, especially diverse students, right? To know one firm is going to treat you a certain way, give you a certain type of respect, give you a certain seat at the table compared to another, it definitely changes the game, right? And, you know, Shanika talked about tokenism. That's still a very real thing here. And, you know, the percentages show that there's not very diverse firms in the Boston area, right? And so no matter where you go, you're going to be one of few. And so when you get there, how are you going to be treated? How are you going to be supported? And especially if there are alum that are already there that are able to tell you the ins and outs in a way that makes you feel one way or the other, that definitely changes the trajectory potentially of some of our students. Now, are there other factors that may play a part? Absolutely. But is diversity, equity, and inclusion something that students are thinking about? Yes. And I think more and more in today's atmosphere, today's society, even more so. And I'm not just talking about the diverse students, right? Our white students also are in this fight. You know, they are looking for and very protective of these words as well. And what are people actually doing beyond just saying them, but actually doing something about it? And so it's not just one or another student, it's all of them that are looking at this at a different lens than I would say even just a year ago today.
I agree. And it's not even just the reputation of a particular firm or organization, it's the reputation of our bar. So what do we want our bar to represent and stand for? I know that many of the diverse students that I graduated with are no longer in Massachusetts. And they tried maybe for the first year. And then when they saw that they kept getting rejected, they left the state and they went to New York or California or DC. And it's a loss because some of these people were the most talented people I've met and intelligent people I've met, and they just weren't getting hired. And I remember as a law student, speaking to someone and kind of being told, you don't want to practice in Massachusetts. You know, it's not a diverse bar and it's not welcoming. So how do we change the reputation of our bar? How do we change the face of our bar in Massachusetts?
Shanika, I'll tell you, I've also heard that, you know, in particular with regard to Boston, you know, that it would be harder for me here. You know, you know, the SJC issued this remarkable letter this summer about racial justice, and you know, there was a shout out to law offices where, you know, they said you need to do better about recruiting and retaining diverse talent. And so I think, you know, it definitely does behoove leadership to kind of get in on this. And, you know, for someone who's trying to convince leadership, right, or to show leadership the efficacy of these efforts, you know, what would you recommend that people say and do to these people, for these people?
I mean, I think one, we have to know the why, right? So why is it important to have a more representative employee group? You know, what's the benefit? And I think sometimes leaders that are the same, they look the same, they think the same, feel that diversity means that you have to recruit less technically skilled individuals. And I think a lot of these conversations are happening in the background, but it's not open. And so how do we, one, change that mindset of just because you're hiring a diverse candidate doesn't mean they're less qualified. A lot of times, diverse candidates have to be more qualified because of the barriers that are in place. I think also, particularly with law firms, in-house counsel can possibly, reject, not give business to law firms that don't value diversity. So that's one thing that in-house counsels can do directly. I know that it's not just about diversity, it's also about the pipeline and the credit for the work. So not just having one diverse candidate on the team, but who's actually leading it, who's actually getting credit for the work being produced. I think also we can, I know there's a coalition of law firms that are committed, or they've committed themselves to racial justice work. What does that actually look like? What is the pro bono work you're doing? How do you look within, right? It's not just about defending individuals, but it's changing the face of your team.
I think that piece is so important. So many firms and organizations will say, oh, well, we represent X culture, we represent X community through pro bono work or through our mission. But then we look at your organizational chart and it's not diverse, or the diversity is at the administrative assistant level or associates, and these associates have been in their positions for 5+ years and cannot move up. Right. And so I think about the buy-in and the leadership. There has to be a cultural shift, right? And you have to be able to step out of your comfort zone. That's really what it's going to take, is for leadership to not fear, in some ways, I think, that bringing someone in that doesn't look like you, that doesn't come from the same background as you, doesn't mean that you're going to then become less than. In fact, you'll become better. And like Shanika said, most of the diverse candidates are overqualified oftentimes, if not just as qualified. And so I think that there has to be a cultural shift. It can't just be we're saying we care about diversity and we're doing pro bono work. It has to be that we're actively recruiting. And so if that means for a little while you have to go to law schools you typically don't, looking at the diverse numbers at schools, right? Are you recruiting in the right ways? Are you recruiting from places like the Boston Lawyers Group? Should there be more things like that your office is recruiting from to gain the diversity at the initial level? And then looking at your mid-level associates, what are you doing to support them in their growth so they don't leave? So they don't leave the Massachusetts bar, they don't leave your firm. Are you asking them, what do they want to do in 5 years? Are you then supporting them? That's what sponsorship is, right? Are you making sure you sponsor their growth? Mentorship and sponsorship are very different things. You as a leader in a firm can sponsor someone to become the next leader. That's not mentoring them on a day-to-day. That's making sure they're at the right seats, in the right rooms to then move up. And I don't think there's enough of that happening, right? And so that's what leaders of firms need to be doing. And they have to think like that. And that, I think, is the challenging part, because change doesn't come easy, and change requires people to be uncomfortable. And we all hate to be uncomfortable.
Exactly. But in the uncomfortability comes progress. And to add something, who are you making partner? Who are you making equity partner? Because I know some individuals that have been at law firms for their entire career, and they might have gotten of counsel, but they never made equity partner. So take a look in the mirror, and why are you not promoting certain types of people to equity partner? It can't be the talent, because they're still within your law firm.
Right. Christine.
No, please go ahead.
I actually think that's a really good segue into our next topic, which is, implicit bias, and how that's often used in the same breath as diversity and inclusion. One of the ways that I've seen implicit bias manifest during the hiring and promotion process is when people refer to someone as whether or not they're a cultural fit, right? Is this something that you've seen before? And if so, how does this kind of thinking impact diversity inclusion from your perspective?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? You know, as Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Suffolk, you know, that all of this is a part of the work that I do day to day, in hiring and thinking of this even from, you know, what our organization looks like and how diverse it is. And so I often am questioning that. What define culture? Define what our culture is. Define what diversity means for us. Is it a top 3 priority when we're hiring, right? Is it on the checklist? That helps you, 1, diversify your pool, but then 2, it helps you hold yourself accountable. Do we have a diverse slate? Are we, you know, reviewing candidates on their merit? Is it a priority? But I often question, what is culture? And I think for me, when we bring that into a question as it relates to hiring, for me, it's another sense of microaggression, right? It's another place that we are aggressing or creating an insult against a group of people that are always marginalized in these areas, right? And so how do we stop doing that, right? You have to check yourself. You have to check your colleagues. And again, this is tough, right? It's not going to happen overnight, but that goes to that equity piece of really thinking about policies, right? What can we do to really recreate job descriptions and search committees and challenging search committees to stick to the merits? What did we put on this paper? What did we call out for? If the person is meeting everything in the job description, how dare us then add something that they cannot defend themselves against? So adding culture, and that's not in the job description. We didn't ask them, could they fit this culture that's undefined? What does that mean? And did you ask them, if you do have a definition for culture, did we talk about it during the interview process, right? That's different than saying, are they a good fit for the culture without even giving them the opportunity to apply and say that they potentially fit the culture.
And do you ask that question of everyone that comes in, right? Is it only certain candidates where you worry that they might not fit the culture? Are you creating systems that can act against your unconscious bias? For example, do you have blinded resumes? Like a name like Shanika or Sharina is pretty clear what our race may be, for example. Are we initially blinding resumes so that we don't have that bias initially? And I agree, like, what are the systems in place? What are your interview process? What is your interview process? Do you have someone on the panel that explicitly looks for the diversity? Is every employer needing to ask that question? Because it's not just about diverse candidates, but it's also getting individuals into your organization that care about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so is there a question for everyone that you interview about what it means to them and how it's important for the organization?
And Shanika, I think that reminds me of a point you made earlier, that sometimes we might need a check in our systems, right? If you have diversity at the top levels of your management, that can only help, right? We need people to push back and who understand these issues and can say, you're putting something on these candidates that you shouldn't be putting on them. So how important is that to these efforts, to have someone in the room who knows this, who has lived it, who understands it?
I think it's important. I also recognize that many places are not there yet. Like they want to have more diverse leadership, but they don't. And so one way of starting that is to have a diversity committee that could be made up of individuals throughout your organization, and they could be a part of the hiring process. So even if they're not leadership, they have a say in who gets into the door.
That's great. And the other thing I think of when I think of that, Shanika, is, you know, allyship, You don't have to be diverse to use your voice. In fact, the best progress is made when it's not the diverse people in the workplace pushing and moving the needle forward, right? And so it's important for someone at the top to say, wow, this is important, and to find the courage to use their privilege, right, to continue this process, to continue to move the needle forward. And so it's so important that we're not just thinking of the diverse people in the room. And quite frankly, they can't do it by themselves. It's not ever going to happen in that way, especially given the fact that there's so little of them in any given place. And so it's important that, you know, organizations think about who could be the allies, who could be the people that are the voice in many ways for the voiceless, right? These employees do not have the same voice at this time as some of their counterparts. And so how are you using your voice? That's something that on a day-to-day, I'm trying to teach my students. I'm not trying to just teach my BIPOC students. I want my white students to be culturally competent in a way to stand next to their BIPOC colleagues, in a way to be an ally for them, in a way to support them, in a way to support them just as they would support their client. And this isn't just in firms, this is in any part of the legal profession. We need more people to be allies and to really own allyship in public and in a private room, right? To use your voice in a way that you otherwise wouldn't.
Exactly. And if you don't know what that is or how to do it, train your leaders. Pay to get trained as a leader on these issues. And also have protocols in place where you actually discipline people who are acting out on their bias towards another individual. Because I think some individuals leave organizations because the culture, there are certain bad actors that are, you know, maybe rainmakers that nothing happens to. They can say or do whatever they want because they bring in a lot of money to the organization, which is important. But if you're losing great talent, like, one, train the leadership, two, have protocols in place for responses to implicit bias or microaggressions, as Sharina mentioned earlier. But I do agree, like, it's not just the diverse individual, it needs to come from everyone. And the aspect of allyship is extremely important because those are often the people that have the voice that the leaders are listening to move things forward, and the power.
To go off of what Shanika's talking about, training, right? Don't just train once, right? And, you know, maybe you don't say it's a training, maybe it's a workshop. You know, I think people get nervous when you use certain vocabulary. Oh, we have to go to another training. I know what implicit bias is. Are you thinking about the trainings and workshops in a way that progresses the understanding and the behavioral change of your organization? Every organization, every firm, every DA's office looks different. Their needs are different. So where are you all? Are you at a place where you haven't had any type of training? So you need that 101. But then when you have another group come in 6 months from now, what does that workshop look like? Is it an LGBTQIA plus training or workshop to really understand what that group of people need and what type of support they need? You know, it's important that we continue the understanding and knowledge to really get behavioral change. It can't be just a one and done thing because our implicit biases change every day. Every experience you have will change how you perceive, how you judge, how you view the world. And so it's really important that we're not just thinking of training and workshops as a one and done thing, but that we're getting understanding and knowledge on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly. And it could be something as simple as a regular line item in your staff meeting agenda. Like every month that you meet or every week that you meet, you're talking about these issues.
I think that's such a great point because you're talking about behavioral change, you know, and the idea that one training is going to change your behavior moving forward, it doesn't make sense. So I think suggestions like that, where, you know, having a monthly reminder, you know, on your agenda that says, how are we talking about this? How are you thinking about this, is a really great suggestion.
And are you meeting the goal? Just like you'll see if you're meeting your financial goals, you'll check in on that. Are you meeting your diversity goals?
I'm interested to hear, we've spoken about microaggressions a few times. Can you give us a couple examples? So, you know, for people who might not even realize, for better or for worse, that they're doing this, what does this look like in the workplace?
It's the little pokes, right? You're jabbing on a day-to-day basis. And it can be anything. It can be things like, you know, even to this day, I hear so many friends say, oh, you know, they're talking about my hair today, right? That's a big one for Black women, is that people are always questioning their hairstyle or asking questions about, why is it long? Why is it short tomorrow? I'm still doing my job, right? And so why are we concerned about what my hair looks like? I think others go to work products. When you're surprised that someone did such a good job, were you surprised that my colleague did a great job on the same work? And in fact, they missed dotting a couple I's and crossing a couple T's, but you still were just as impressed with their work as mine as a Black woman. And so those are the types of microaggressions that happen every day in the workplace.
And even little things. I remember a job I previously had, my first day of work, I had the HR training, and the person said, oh, are you a new administrative assistant here? And I was like, no, I'm not. So changing the face of what a lawyer looks like in your organization. Yeah, it's very small things that sort of pick at someone's impression of what you should be like based off of your certain diverse stereotype. So if you are speaking a certain way, oh, you speak well, I'm surprised. Or if you, like Sharita said, if you did just a good job, oh, great job on that. But overly praising individuals, where it feels like a sense of surprise versus a sense of just gratitude for your work.
I wanted to touch back on racial justice for a moment. Can a law firm or a company, I mean, it's such an extremely important topic, and you know, we do have this letter from the SJC that was remarkable from the state's highest court, Supreme Judicial Court, and the justices wrote that this must be a time not just of reflection, but of action. And it's really a call to action for every single lawyer, every single judge in the bar of Massachusetts. So my question is, can a law firm and a company really truly say that they're committed to diversity and inclusion if they're not addressing racial justice?
I would say no. But addressing racial justice looks different for everyone. But I would say, for example, at the law firm level, I've heard that it's hard for certain pro bono activities to be approved if they're directly related to racial justice, because it could be seen as creating a stance that the law firm doesn't want to be represented by as far as their clients. If you are not doing things in a way that I feel or a person feels is promoting their culture or protecting their culture, then that can create a sense of non-belonging. So one thing that COVID did is that it made everyone watch what was happening as far as the police brutality, et cetera. But that wasn't the first time. It's the first time that so many people spoke up and were allies. And that created a sense of belonging for everyone. I do think it's important to have the dialogue, right? Because different employees feel different ways about the issue, and that's okay, and having an open dialogue, and shifting the narrative to a place of, let's have this conversation. This is why this is important to me, or this is my misunderstanding, protest versus riot, etc. Because it's happening around us. And so if you stay quiet on the issue, it could cause you to lose talent.
And thinking about it another way, you know, racial justice is diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? If you think and you look back to the history of these terms, right? It's diversity before it was multicultural, before it was just for, you know, a lot of these processes and procedures were just for Black and African American attorneys in the legal profession, right? They were the diverse group that people were looking to pipeline in, right? Before we thought of so many other marginalized groups, rightfully so. But so when you think about saying racial justice and not including it in diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're doing yourself, your firm, your organization, and not doing it justice, not doing a service, right? You have to think about racial justice. This is a part of the problem, right? Is that we are not a racially diverse practice. And we are not just as just to our racially diverse attorneys, racially diverse clients, even in the ways that we should. And so even if you don't think about society, right? The SJC's message about action, what are you doing internally, right? I don't even think about that as, should we be doing more pro bono? Because maybe your firm's already been doing pro bono, right? That's not enough anymore, right? It shouldn't have been enough even before this year, right? What are you doing to add representation, to create equitable measures to assess and move people up in promotions? What are you doing to make sure people feel included at a table and feel belonged in the community, right? That is racial justice. That is it at its very base, is making sure that human beings in your firm, in your DA's office, in your organization feel as if they are here, that they belong here, and that they are included in the processes and procedures. That's racial justice at its base.
Thank you, Sharina. I think that's important to know, like, what it is, right? So, like, when I think racial justice, I think being treated in an equitable way, regardless of my race, you know? And I don't think that's a hard ask. And like you said, it could be within society, but it's also within the workplace.
So you guys have shared a lot of concrete steps about what folks should be doing to support diversity, inclusion, and equity. What is your highest priority for today and tomorrow? What should employers be doing right now to support these goals?
I think first they can look internally. So who's within your team, who's within your company, and how can you build a sense of belonging within your company today? And a lot of that may have to deal with putting financial resources in play to build that financial belonging. Putting diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging on your agenda for staff meetings, making it a goal that you evaluate progress quarterly or yearly, and looking at your leadership and how to recruit and retain, of course, more diverse leaders, or how to promote within. So if there are individuals within your organization that are already doing great work, how do you promote them to positions of leadership? I think that's something that could be done today.
Today and tomorrow, I think more of us need to be flying the plane while we're building it as it pertains to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Focusing on one of these terms and what they mean is not enough. You know, action really is getting that diversity committee, getting a chief diversity officer, finding the capacity to support the staff that needs to be in place to really do the cultural shift so that all of these things become reality. And it's going to take working on each of them little by little, but at the same time. Not one is more important to me for today than the other. And that is true even in the work I'm doing at Suffolk University Law School, right? I am looking at representation, prospective students, as well as faculty and staff here. How are we making our campus more representative, right, of all diverse backgrounds? And then also looking at that equity. Are we having equitable measures in place across the law school, across the law firm, across the nonprofit? You have to take the time to look into that. And if it means finding the dollars to hire someone, right, just as much as we find the dollars to do other things, that is, you know, walking the walk and not just writing a purpose statement, right? That Black Lives Matter, or that racial injustice is, you know, we don't stand for racial injustice, right? Going beyond that, finding the dollars to really look internally and do the work that needs to be done to do a cultural shift. It's so important that we're looking at all four words today. Finding whatever you need to look at all four words and make the cultural shift.
And if a part of that is the chief diversity officer, I just want to say again, they need to have the resources. They need to be in a position within core leadership, and they also need to have a budget for employees.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your insights. We have a bunch of questions and not a lot of time to get to them, so I'm just going to open this up and start firing away. We have Kimberly Corbett asks, I've noticed that a J is being added to the term DEI. Do you see justice will play a part in the future?
It's a great question. I say yes. But I think that we all have to be careful with adding terms when we don't even fully necessarily know how to define or act out the terms we have today. Right? That goes back to the historical piece. We'll change the terms, we'll add a term, but yet the legal profession looks the same it did 10 years ago. In terms of racial diversity, right? And so we've been talking about diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity and inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging, multicultural, racial justice. We've been talking about these terms for decades, right? But in terms of representation, that first D, that diversity, I mean, the numbers are the same. So do we really care about diversity and inclusion? Do we really know what that means? I don't know. If you're looking statistically, I don't know that we care as much as we say we do.
And I just echo everything Sharina said.
Great. Susan White asks, what are your thoughts about how the inherent elitism of the legal culture permeates everything and affects success? We continue to build a boundary between lawyer and non-lawyer. Example, everywhere else talks about unconscious, but in legal it's implicit bias. To get to the highest partner level in most law firms, you need a very large book of business, not your merit as a lawyer doing legal work. Unless you come from a high economic status, having the network that helps you build your book is difficult in most large firms.
I think that's where sponsorship and mentorship plays in, right? Especially for first generation attorneys. You really, law is an apprenticeship. So in order to learn the business of law, in order to learn how to practice law, you need someone willing to mentor you and sponsor you. And if we can increase that, we can make it so that this profession feels open to everyone, regardless of your economic status.
And again, mentorship and sponsorship earlier rather than later, right? If we are getting to law students of first generation of BIPOC backgrounds when they are law students and helping educate them on what it's going to look like to be in a firm, what you're going to need to do to prepare yourself to move up the ladder, right? That gives them that equitable leg up that their peers are going to be able to catch up, because they may get it the day of, right? But that is something a BIPOC or a first gen attorney may not get the first day they go into the firm, right? They're gonna get it a year or two later than their white counterparts. And so if we can get to some of these folks earlier, so that when their white counterpart catches up, at least they then are equitably at the same place. So I think that it's important to think about mentorship and sponsorship earlier.
This is sort of a related question, but I mean, do you think that, at least in the Boston legal community, do we have enough of a meritocracy that we're really judging people based on talent as we should, or are we allowing other factors to come into play?
Again, what does that mean, right? The definition of merit is different in every firm, organization, what you consider merit of a lawyer. Some people say merit is the school they went to, right? Are we defining people based on merit such as their work ethic and what legal experience they have? Or are we adding things to what merit is? And I think that's the first question, is how are we defining merit? And then we have to hold ourselves accountable to our definition. If we're saying we are going to look at a Suffolk student the same way we're going to look at a Harvard student based on their qualifications, right? And what school you went to is not a part of our qualifications. We have to hold ourselves accountable to that. And that again goes to cultural shift, because right now the reality is that isn't how many of us view hiring, right? And so we have to make a conscious effort and decision to, go against what the societal status quo is as it pertains to merit.
I agree. I think also if you look at the city of Boston, it's a very segregated city, but it's also a very diverse city. What opportunities are we giving to diverse residents from the city? Because I'm from Boston originally, and my high school is very diverse. But when I went into the legal field, that diversity was not the same, was not represented. So what's happening, not just for law students, but college students, high school students? How are we creating a pipeline for these residents that are most likely to stay in the city anyway? And how do we reflect that diversity in our clients, in our community, in our bar?
And Sharina, this is a question mostly for you, but also for Shanika. You touched on earlier that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, these are really important to law students, and they're expecting this of their employers. Do you anticipate that this is really going to change what we see in our law firms and our companies because our talent is requiring it?
I do. And, I go to diversity conferences across the nation, and I hear what some firms are doing, and some firms are already, or some big clients of firms have already said, we are not going to, continue to do our business with you if you are not having a more diverse group of attorneys working with us. And so, what I tell my students even if you're a white student, it's going to benefit you if you come in more culturally competent, right? Because then at least the clients are going to want to work with you, right? So I don't think that firms should just be looking at it from a talent. I think that, you know, firms are going to be getting hit on both sides. I think that clients and talent are going to be demanding that, you know, we're more diverse, that we're more equitable, that we're more inclusive. I do think that this next generation of attorneys is much more aware. They are holding many more accountable, and they are not afraid or shy to note that implicit bias is important, that racial justice is important, that equitable measures are important. They challenge the institutions they're going to, and I think that there's nothing to be said that they're not going to be challenging their next step in their careers, which will be firms, DA's offices, and other organizations and corporations.
All right, Mabel has a question about metrics. What metrics are firms, I think we can ask firms, companies, using to track DEIB efforts and outcomes? What are your top 3 metrics?
I think one metric is a retention. So if you're retaining the talent that shows a sense of belonging and maybe inclusion might exist. Another metric is leadership. Where are the diverse employees? Are they just at in administrative roles, or are they part of leadership? And then another metric I think that is underutilized is surveying your team and getting information from people within your organization on how they feel you're doing in these areas.
And I think we have time for one last question here. Maria Joseph is asking, I'm interested in knowing whether anyone has found the use of an ombudsperson or neutral facilitator helpful in addressing internal concerns or obstacles at work, school, professional organizations, etc., regarding diversity. If not, would you expect that resource to be useful?
I do think that it could be useful to have a neutral person in the room in some ways. I think that it should be potentially someone who is experienced in this work, or someone that is from the marginalized group. And I say that because a lot of times it just needs to be someone that potentially understands where all sides are coming from. And so if you're experienced in this space, similar to a negotiator who's experienced with viewing both sides in a impartial way, right? I think it minimizes the bias. I can tell you at the university level, we do think about that. And even if it's an internal person, right? But they are not a part of whatever that process may be. So if it's someone that traditionally is not a part of hiring, are we bringing someone in to double check that search committee, right? They weren't a part of the day-to-day process of the search. And so are they coming in the middle to kind of do a flashlight check on the search committee, right? So it doesn't have to even be somebody always external to the organization to have an ombudsperson a part of the process. It could even just be someone that wasn't a part of the day-to-day of what said committee or leadership is doing. I do think that it is important because that person can be, like I said, impartial or less biased because they weren't a part of the process.
And I just want to leave with a couple thoughts. Sharina, I know you're very passionate about building a pipeline. So what are, for law firms, leaders in law firms, leader in corporations who want to build that, who want to be hiring diverse candidates, what are the top things they can do right now, today, tomorrow, to assist in that?
Yeah, I mean, if you have the dollars, contact a law school to do a pipeline program, a full pipeline program that really reaches into high schools, reaches into colleges. Shanika talked about the fact that this is a majority diverse city. What are we doing to utilize the talent in Dorchester and Mattapan and Hyde Park? Are we pulling those high school students in? Are we pulling those college students in? So I think if you are very at the high level, if you are really interested in finding somewhere to put diversity dollars, maybe we can have a side conversation about a pipeline program, right? But even just smaller than that, that mentorship piece, right? What are we doing to mentor diverse students, first generation students? That is something that costs little to nothing for us to be doing as legal professionals and as attorneys. So I would say that is something for sure that people could be doing. So that's two. And the third thing I think that we can be doing to help the pipeline is really thinking about the merit conversation and our policies around hiring and promotion. Because if we're able to get to a place where we can hold ourselves accountable to what we're saying our hiring processes are, our promotion processes are, and holding ourselves accountable to that, you'll see a growth within the pipeline from graduating law students to young attorneys, right? So we have to reconsider and think about our policies. And again, that costs little to nothing if you are a firm or organization that already has created a diversity committee, already has a chief diversity officer. That is something that you can say is one of our first goals, to Shanika's point of adding it to an agenda, right? Saying, how's the policies going? So those are the three things that I think of for immediate impact as it relates to the pipeline for diverse candidates to become new hires in law firms and other places.
And just to expand a bit on what Sharina said, all of those initiatives can happen across the state. So we think Boston, but this is true for Springfield, for Worcester, for all the cities across the Commonwealth.
Sharina, I expect you have a lot of emails in your inbox. I hope you do.
A lot of money, yeah.
I want to sincerely thank you both so much, Shanika and Sharina. You've shared incredible insight today, and I know that it's been incredibly helpful to us, and I'm sure to our participants here today. I want to thank again our sponsors for the event, Nelson Mullins, Verrill, Mass Lawyers Weekly, and Color Magazine. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you everyone so much for attending. We hope that that was informative, and thank you again. So we're going to turn it back over to Susan.
Thank you. Thank you to Christine and Melanie and Shanika and Sharina for sharing their insights with us this morning. That was a very interesting and really very thought-provoking presentation.